Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to this historic building, which I've been told has housed for some time UK Parliament. Winston Churchill made many famous speeches here during the Second World War. The United Nations was homed here for a while, and here we are today. So welcome. I'm Sasha Rose-Neal. I'm the Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of Sussex. It's lovely to see some familiar faces. I've been here about 8 or 9 months now, not here at Sussex. And so I'm starting to know some of you, but there are lots of new faces too, and I'm looking forward to saying hello to you. It gives me an enormous pleasure to introduce this panel event today on probably one of the most hotly debated topics of our lifetimes, the challenges of Brexit, and particularly the challenges to UK trade 7 years on. It's really wonderful to meet the special guests who are here tonight, including alumni and current students of the University of Sussex Business School. I hope you've already had a chance to mingle with each other, to meet up with people that you know and meet some new people and get to know each other a little bit. Now, many of you will know that the business school at Sussex was started just 15 years ago and that it now has a really enviable reputation for teaching and research. 6 of the business school's academics are now in the top 1% of most cited researchers globally. And the business school performs very well in national university league tables. But particularly interesting is that how the school is attracting really impressively large research grants and is currently top amongst business schools in the UK for research income. Now that's, I think, a really stellar achievement for a business school that's only 15 years old. And we're up against a lot of big names and very well-established business schools. This is really, I think, quite phenomenal and a really great endorsement of the quality of research, because you don't get research funding on that scale if you're not doing really excellent research. But I think what really makes the school stand out is the relevance of the research that's going on there to the world right now and to the future of the world, from how climate change and pandemics affect business supply chains to the ethics of deploying artificial intelligence in the workplace. The business school is really researching some of the most important and pressing issues in economics, business, management, human resource management, accounting, many other areas. As you no doubt remember, in the aftermath of the 2016 referendum, we went through quite a challenging time in this country. It's maybe died down a bit, but there was a huge amount of confusion as to what would happen to our trade agreements once we left the EU. But at Sussex, our economists and our business specialists immediately stepped up. Right after the Brexit vote, they recognised that there was a breadth and depth of knowledge at Sussex that had been built up over 50 years since the foundation of the Science Policy Research Unit. And those staff came together to form the UK Trade Policy Observatory, UKTPO as we call it, in partnership with Chatham House. UKTPO has been generously supported by a number of alumni since its establishment, and its expertise has very significantly helped to inform debate about the UK's place in the international economy. It's benefited policymakers, the public, and our global trading partners. Last year, UKTPO received funding for a new £12 million research centre for inclusive trade policy. Sussex leads this centre, which comprises academics and external partners, including government departments, across all 4 UK nations. The ambition is to equip the UK with the capability to formulate and implement an effective, inclusive trade policy that delivers something for all parts of our society. I'm now going to hand over to the Dean of the University of Sussex Business School, Professor Steven McGuire, who has a far greater understanding of all this than I do, and who is therefore going to introduce the panel and chair the discussion. And there will be a lot of opportunity for you to ask questions of our expert panel. So thank you very much for coming. It's wonderful to have you here, to have your support, and I hope you have a really interesting and enlightening and engaging evening. And please do ask your questions. Thank you.
So good evening, everybody. in the session. Thank you very much for the warm introduction. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm just moderating the panel, and so what I'll do is we'll let each individual, each of my colleagues, introduce themselves. Ingo is then going to take you through a bit of UKTPO's history because it's a really, really interesting one, and in many respects I think is absolutely Sussex as an institution at its very, very best in terms of responding to societal challenges. And then I'm going to ask him a couple of questions each so we get warmed up, and then that will give you time for the real zinger questions during the open Q&A, but they're ready for it, trust me. So with that, I'll just turn over to Ingo, please.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, and indeed thank you very much to all of you for coming, and for your interest in trade at Sussex. I'm Ingo Borchert. I'm a Deputy Director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory and a theme leader in that new Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy. By training, I'm an economist, and I came to Sussex 11 years ago, from the World Bank in Washington, incidentally to the Mantell building, just in case that evoked any fond memories from any one of you. That's, of course, now given place to a very nice East Slope new student residence. As part of the introductions, let me expand a little bit on what the Vice Chancellor has said about the UKTPO and the CITP. The UK Trade Policy Observatory is a research centre housed at the Business School that was immediately founded a week after the Brexit referendum by Professor Alan Winters. And the idea was to pull all the expertise that we had at Sussex together and that we have had for a long time. And UKTPO is a group of academics at Sussex from across different schools. It's domiciled in the business school, as it were, but it includes colleagues from the law school and from international relations. And these think tank of Sussex academics come together to analyze trade policy and to give impartial advice and training. We've thus far produced 74 briefing papers. They're out there in the display table. I've made sure to bring certainly numbers 74 and 73 just to show how far we've come, but also briefing papers from CITP. Clearly, this UKTPO was sparked by Brexit, and therefore we've done a lot of work on Brexit, but also more general on the WTO, on the multilateral trading system. We are monitoring the data, we are crunching the numbers, and we've done a lot of work on the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Mattia has done a lot of work on the Northern Ireland Protocol, and we've also done work, increasingly so under CITP, on trade and climate change and sustainability, very much like the Vice Chancellor said, the big questions that are going to matter for generations to come. UKTPO has also attracted research funding. We got grants for governance after Brexit and an award for work on UK-India, and we've advised a lot of government departments along the way, what used to be the Department for International Trade, but a range of other departments as their work relates to trade. Now, CITP is a new kid on the block, and it's one of two big ESRC-funded research centers. The Vice Chancellor has given you a number, so CITP is a 12 million grant that are one of two centers at the Business School. I'm peeking over to Steve. Steve is not smiling. I thought he was smiling sort of happily because it's quite unusual to have two of these big research centers in the same school. That's rare, and it's quite nice. It's quite something. But unlike UKTPO, CITP transcends Sussex. As the Vice Chancellor said, it's a 5-year award that is a consortium of 6 big UK universities. It's also Nottingham, Strathclyde, Queen's University in Belfast, so you see all the UK nations and regions are represented, and also Cambridge. But Sussex is a lead institution, and within Sussex is that core UKTPO trade crowd who is leading CITP. Plus international partners, we got Tel Aviv and Berkeley and Florence, the European University Institute, and importantly also private sector partners, and also devolved administrations are on board. The aim of the center is to put a focus on the inclusivity of trade. And what do I mean by that? Inclusiveness of trade as it affects all of us, you and me, as individuals, as consumers, as directors or workers, but also in terms of trade policy formulation. So who gets to say, in in trade policy, and who should have a say in this. In order to achieve this, we've organized ourselves around 3 core research themes. The first one is people, firms, and places. It does exactly what it says on the tin. We want to analyze how trade and trade policy making is affecting individuals in different places and businesses, of course, as the main actors who trade. The second one is digitization and technological change, just on account of the profound change of technology on trade. And the third one is negotiating a turbulent world, on which Emily is leading, and I'm sure she's going to say a few more words on this. I'm leading the first theme, people, firms, and places, and I think we are up to some really nice and captivating research. Paul Krugman said productivity isn't everything, but in the long run, it's almost everything, right? And Paul Krugman is typically right. So one of the interesting projects that we have is looking at firm-level productivity across space. It's got an unprecedented granular data set looking at productivity at the firm level, and not just Wales versus Scotland, but in the travel-to-work area. So we will be able to really look in a very granular way to how productivity evolves and how that benefits individuals, workers, and firms. We aspire to create a jobs in trade database, several projects around this, because at the end of the day, what we and many politicians for that matter care about is employment, jobs, and wages and skills. So that's an important part of that theme. And lastly, it's not just all from economists for economists or from lawyers for lawyers. We've also got a project on the perceived unfair gains of globalization and voter attitude, radical voter sentiment. So that's interdisciplinary part of it. I think I'll leave it here as a short introduction, expanding on what the Vice-Chancellor has kindly said about both. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks very much, Ingo. So Emily and then Mattia, if you could just introduce yourselves, then we'll get underway with the questions. So Emily.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily Lydgate, and I am here tonight representing the School of Law, Politics, and Sociology, where I am a reader in environmental law. Like Ingo, I'm also a deputy director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory, and as he mentioned, a theme leader for the Center for Inclusive Trade Policy. And I think that we have developed quite an unusual ability to create outputs that are policy-facing and also really clearly informed by both legal analysis and economic analysis, which is something that I'm quite proud of, because I think in the trade policy space, having both of those perspectives together can be extremely useful. I think I'll wait for the discussion to speak more about specific CITP research projects, but I would also just flag that for the past few years I've been advising one of the parliamentary committees, the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee, on the impacts of trade and trade policy on environment and the farming sector. And that's also been a really interesting way of thinking about how the UK makes trade policy and how they can improve that process. Over to you, Mattia.
All right, thanks, Emily. So I'll be a bit briefer so we have time for our questions. But I'm a research fellow at the Department of Economics in Sussex, and I'm a fellow of the UKTPO and a colleague of Emily and Ingo at the CITP. So I'm actually an alumnus of Sussex myself. Came to Sussex in 2010 for my MSc and then decided to stay for my PhD with Alan Winters. And after a brief separation of a couple of years while I was in Ireland, I quickly came back as soon as UKTP was founded, almost maybe a year after or so.
Wisely so.
Wisely, very wisely. It's been a very successful time. It's a unique group to work with. We do rigorous academic research and a lot of engagement, so we hope to have also a great deal of impact. I did quite a lot of research on trade and development topics, to which I will speak tonight, but clearly our attention has been recently grabbed by Brexit, as Ingo has already mentioned, but I'll leave it at that, so we have enough discussion time.
Perfect. Thanks very much, all. Right, so here's the order we're going to go in. I'm going to ask each of you 2 questions, so succinct answers, and we're going to kick off with Emily. Okay. All right? Emily, climate crisis and its interaction with trade policy. Can you talk us through how that works?
Okay, well, I mean, I guess I would say that the trade policy dimension of addressing the climate crisis is I think, really at the core, and also is one of the trickiest areas going forward in terms of sort of a collective action problem. And the reason for that is quite simply, we live in an interconnected global economy. So there's various metrics for this, but probably the easiest one is just, look around you, the clothes you're wearing, the phone in your pocket, et cetera. They have components from, how many different countries. And this raises this question of responsibility. So am I, as the person, or the UK as the country which receives the iPhone, responsible for reducing the emissions in it? Or is the producing country responsible for that? And what's really interesting, I think, is that the approach of the Paris Agreement and also sort of national net zero targets is that they just look at reducing domestic emissions. And the idea is that if we all reduce our domestic emissions, then the problem is solved, right? But we're entering a world in which it's much easier to emit in some countries than others, right? Because some countries have more stringent carbon pricing or climate policies. So the concern that many countries are starting to have is that we're entering, we used to talk in the 90s about pollution havens, and we may be entering a world where we have, emissions havens. So, and there's another complex dimension to this, which is that developing countries actually have legally less responsibility to mitigate their emissions for good historical and contemporary reasons. So one of the things that we're interested in the Center for Inclusive Trade Policy is thinking about how countries like the UK, who are relatively ambitious in their approach to climate policy, can use trade policy and address the emissions coming into products that they're importing in a way that is sort of fair and also feasible. Most recently we wrote a report for the Committee on Climate Change, which is the UK committee which is tasked with holding the UK government to account on reaching its net zero target. And it's 120 pages, but the short version of our conclusions are, first of all, it does seem to us that using trade policy in this way to address emissions embodied in stuff is going to be an important part of the toolkit going forward. But it's also a really only part of the toolkit, because it doesn't really get to the heart of that issue of why are countries still using coal and very high emitting technologies. And obviously there's many reasons for that, political reasons, but particularly for poor countries, they might not have the immense domestic subsidies to support their low carbon transition. They might not have the technology transfer, the big multinationals introducing these lower carbon technologies, and they might not have the investment. So essentially, just introducing these sort of punitive border measures is maybe part of the picture, but we need to also look more broadly, because we're only going to decarbonize as quickly as sort of our slowest, our worst performers.
Great. Thanks, Emily. Really, really helpful. So now I'm going to ask a question of our services expert. So Ingo, often I start when I used to teach, I'd talk about the importance of services and how it was to some extent overlooked and has been overlooked for many years. So could you just explain the particular challenges associated with understanding services trade and why it's important?
Yes, thanks, Steve. I'm glad you're mentioning this, because it does fly under the radar, and services makes up 70% of UK GDP, right? Manufacturing is like under 10%. It's hard to believe, but it's almost, no, not all of that is tradable, of course, but services are very important. And thinking about services in the context of trade, I think it's important for at least two reasons. The first one is just the sheer magnitude of the numbers involved. The UK is the only major economy which exports nearly as much services as it does goods. And that is an underestimate, which I'm going to explain in a moment. And second is digitization is affecting pretty much everything, but it is particularly impactful on services trade. And so I think the future of UK trade is going to be services. And experiencing this mega trend of digitization outside the fold of the EU single market just adds an extra layer of complexity to it, which I'm sure we're going to come in the questions later on. So, why is it quantitatively important. I don't want to kick about figures too much, but I think it's useful to just put a number on it. In 2021, the UK exported 313 billion worth of services. And that contrasts with 323 billion worth of goods. So it's pretty much just 50-50, right? And there's no other economy in the world who does quite like the UK export services. A lot of that is professional business services. Now here we are in the city, right? So people think about financial services, and rightly so. But that big bunch of professional business services that the UK exports is actually twice as large, right? Than financial services out of the city. And then, of course, there's telecoms, ICT, and transportation. Now, of note, we are all from the university, higher education sector. There's a whopping 16 billion worth of educational services exports. The UK is very, very good in exporting its education. And that is the foreign students coming to us, and that's what's behind these 16 billion. That does not include at all the campuses, the overseas campuses. So Nottingham, for instance, has a campus in China, in Ningbo. They have a Malaysia campus, and I think they have a third one somewhere. And other UK universities have as well. So that's establishing commercial presence abroad. That's investment flows, and that's not even counted in there. If you add, you realize I'm smuggling the ways of trading services in here, right? So people can come, you can set up abroad, you can email it directly, and you can, as a natural person, go abroad and discharge your service. Various ways of trading services. But if you just added investment flows to it, Tesco's is one of the biggest retailers worldwide. If you added that to it, the number would easily double. So that's one reason why it is really important. The numbers are just big. The other interesting aspect is that services trade is much more resilient than goods trade. Certainly in the global financial crisis in 2008-9, also partly to Brexit and certainly to the pandemic. If you look at a time series, right, goods trade just tanks, minus 20, minus 30%. And business services just takes a gentle dip, and then up we are, right? And that's important. I think policymakers have caught on to this. That's another benefit. And Steve asked for a succinct answer, so I'll just very briefly mention digital. Digital trade globally is equally important. It's embarrassing, we have about estimates for 2019-18. It's about 5 to 6 trillion US dollars. Now that's so mind-bogglingly large, it doesn't mean anything really, but it's a quarter of world trade. A quarter of goods and commercial services trade is digital. And that is growing, even for the UK. Right? 1995, UK's digital exports were about 30%. Now it's 50%, right? So that's growing, and that's why it's important. I think I'll just leave it with there, hoping that we can come to policies, services trade policies, actually, in a little while.
We'll get to that, absolutely. By the way, I did not know that overseas campuses were not included in those figures. That's it. So
no, because these figures are just balance of payments. Okay. Investment flows and sales from investment abroad is not in there. It's not in that 300 billion.
All right. So Mattia, trade and development. What can the UK government do to sort of utilize, or maybe should it, its newfound trade policy freedoms to aid development? What are sort of the challenges associated with that?
All right, sure. Well, short answer is the UK should definitely try and use this trade policy to help development, right? Trade can be a very powerful tool for economic growth, presents huge opportunities for development, right? Going back to the very basics, as countries started to specialize and integrate and exporting to each other, importing from each other, right? We all know how this grows GDP and incomes, at least on average within a country. Trade gives us access to cheaper products, good for consumers. It gives us access to better inputs, higher technology content inputs, so it helps firms grow in productivity. Clearly, trade has also its downsides. As certain industries expand, some industries have to contract. These are the industries that produce things you buy from abroad. And this creates job losses. Now, thinking about developing countries, job losses can be particularly problematic because often people end up in informal sectors or out of the labor force completely. Another concern when trading with developing countries is that often there are conditions, such as laxer worker protection or environmental protection regulations that allows firms to benefit from a cost advantage when relocating to developing countries. So enhancing trade with developing countries could potentially deteriorate workers and development and environmental conditions. So what's the UK government doing? It's trade policy is trying to address both these sort of advantages and the shortcomings of trading with developing countries. And its flagship policy is this Developing Countries Trading Scheme. You might have heard of it. This is a scheme which has recently been reformed. It's been inherited from the EU. The EU calls it the Generalized System of Preferences. And it's one of those schemes, as there are many around the world, whereby developed countries offer more advantageous trading conditions to developing countries in the form of lower tariffs. So to give you an example, if the UK imports a piece of garment from Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, the tariff applied on that import flow is 0. It is much lower than than the tariff applied on the same import flow from Brazil or China or the US. So there's a competitive advantage offered to developing countries. Now, it must be stressed that this treatment is offered non-reciprocally. So developing countries do not have to do the same when the UK exports goods to them. So developing countries are not exposed to the strain of having to lower their tariffs. So this is the main mechanism through which trade policy has tried to help growth or trade-led growth in developing countries. Now, a particular aspect of preferential scheme that I would like to quickly mention is that in recent years, these schemes have been tried to push also non-trade objectives. We know about the poor performance in terms of human rights and labor rights that some of these developing countries suffer from. So donor countries or developed countries such as the EU and also the UK, as long as it was part of the EU, tried to make this preferential treatment for developing countries conditional on some progress on human rights and labor standards by making these preferences conditional on ratifying international conventions, ILO conventions on labor rights or UN conventions on human rights. Now, the UK has recently decided to change this policy. It decided it's not worth continuing with this conditionality system. In other words, it has abandoned the intention of trying to to push ratification of conventions in exchange for better market access. Now, this can be considered problematic if you think of sustainable development issues, but two sort of things can explain a little bit this decision. On one side, there's really no evidence that this policy has worked. So just imposing ratification of conventions, we don't have evidence that it has led to any progress in human and labor rights abroad. And on the other side, imposing that as a condition to grant trade preferences kind of deprives countries that could benefit from an economic advantage from the advantage you could offer them if they don't ratify the convention. So I think the UK government has decided to try and offer as much of as an economic benefit as it can to try and promote trade through exports, and that's it. A simpler approach, perhaps it works.
Thanks, Mattia. What I'm going to change up the order because I wanted to sort of give you a chance to expand on some of the trade-offs. If we think about the Sustainable Development Goals generally, and not developing countries, but the goals themselves, how do you see trade policy being? What sort of trade-offs, what sort of sacrifices are we going to have to make between an effective trade policy and one that works for say, the UK, that also acknowledges about people's expectations around the SDGs?
Well, this is a very tough question, Steve. And it's a hotly debated topic, right? Because it's about the remit of trade policy. How far can we push trade agreements and combine objectives that are often conflictual, such as pursuing environmental protection and economic growth and offering better labor standards all at once in the same agreement. So on one side, we see trade agreements making an effort, or at least negotiators making an effort in recognizing the importance of these SDGs. And in the text of the agreements, there's a growing number of provisions. The provisions are often even made binding. So there could, in principle, be trade sanctions if you violate SDG-related provisions, in particular those related to worker rights. In practice, we don't see much of an effect of these provisions, precisely because, well, most of them are not binding, and even when they are binding, the mechanism to trigger the sanction would be too harsh, such as, for instance, terminating a trade agreement for anyone wanting to use that. trade agreements are mostly instruments of economic integration, and that goal still dominates over any other non-trade objective. Just to conclude on that, do these provisions have any hope to, any purpose at all in these agreements? We have tried to look into this quite rigorously from a statistical point of view, and there is, some glimmer of hope. We do see that some of the environmental provisions, in particular those related to pollution, sort of lowering emissions of CO2 or the use of renewable energy, seem to be causally affecting these, to have an impact on their intended outcome. In parallel, we see also some negative effect on the investment flows, which is what you'd expect if now you're going to have to comply with stricter environmental regulation abroad. So, as you said, there's trade-offs. Probably there's a price to pay to achieve these objectives, but who's down to pay that is, I guess, for another discussion.
Okay, thank you. So, last two questions, then we'll open it up to the floor. So, Emily, one of the interesting bits about CITP has been the use of citizens' juries. Can you just give us a flavor of what they're saying?
Yeah, and it's actually a great segue because it's just about what you were just talking about, which is what is trade policy for, what is it supposed to accomplish, and who decides that. And I think the deep history of our interest in citizens' juries comes back to, the reason why we're probably all in this room talking about UK trade policy, which, I hope you haven't come to regret that decision at this stage, but, which is, thanks to Brexit, right? So one thing that I really took away from the Brexit referendum was that there was a kind of a profound failure to communicate, I think, really on both sides about what the different practical outcomes of different choices would look like, and also about the fact that, there are trade-offs inherent in those. So, yes, you could have, the UK could have much more ability to set its own regulations if it leaves the single market, but it might also mean that it's a lot harder for musicians to play in the EU, or for UK musicians to play in the EU, or vice versa. So just that kind of that sense, not passing judgment on what trade-offs you want to choose. I mean, you're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts, right? But there's just this sense of needing to to know that this isn't a consequence-free decision, right? There are different repercussions of that choice. So I think as trade policy specialists, we watch this with great interest. And so I think that the motivating premise of the citizens' juries is more or less, we wanted to, in a sense, try to explain some of these trade-offs inherent in trade policy, to present scenarios to members of the public who we wouldn't normally interact with. So we set up sort of 5 different juries of about 20 people representing all different nations of the UK, and basically ask them how would they navigate these strategic decisions. And importantly, we also wanted this to guide our research agenda, because we are the Center for Inclusive Trade Policy, and part of that agenda has to be that it's not just us from on high, literally we're on high right now, coming up with what we think are the important questions, but we want those to be shaped and informed by by inputs from various sources. So the report has just come out the day before yesterday. It's available, you can find it easily if you go to the CITP website, but I'll just highlight really quickly, if I can, just one thing which I thought was interesting in that report, which is that people were really concerned about the complexity of the issues, and they wanted more expertise. So they wanted independent expertise to be presented not only to them, but to feed into decision-making processes. And I thought that was, in a sense, a very heartening outcome for us in the context of some quite disparaging statements about experts that were made in the past. So I'll stop there, Steve.
So now they want experts. Okay.
So the CITP short briefing paper, I think, summary of the citizens' juries is available on the display
Okay,
table,
there you
alongside some UKTPO briefing papers, but the CITP paper on citizens' juries is also available.
Great.
Yeah.
Ingo, thanks very much. So last question to you, then we'll get to the audience. So I'm going to rephrase this because this is a big question about services, which you've described as huge. So imagine we are back here 10 years from now. What do you think would be the most significant change that you would report in UK services trade?
Yes, I think probably two. One is trade policy and other public policies would have merged much, much more, and the line between them have probably blurred up to a point of that you can't tell them apart anymore, especially in services. Because, if I ask people, what is a services trade policy, what is that? It can be anything from a licensing requirement for a lawyer to an equity limitation for a foreign bank, to any, none of this looks and feels like a trade policy, but all of this is behind the border domestic regulation. Emily mentioned cross-border data flow regulation that was part of the citizens' juries. So aligning, it will be interesting to see 10 years from now how the UK has managed to align its trade policy with its other public policy objectives. Now, the UK has an artificial intelligence strategy, it's got a national data strategy, it's got a digital strategy, for that matter, and how all of that has played out. If all of these players make decisions in the remit or in the realm of public policy, they almost inadvertently also make trade policy, right? To give an example, right, the UK Competition and Markets Authority has just newly set up a digital markets unit. And rightly so, because in the digital economy is in good part driven by digital intermediary platforms. It's a platform economy, and the conduct of these entities matter a great deal, and the rights and obligations that they have. Now, if the digital market unit makes some market interventions to curtail anti-competitive practices perhaps, or other forms of these platforms, they make trade policy. Because none of these platforms are domiciled in the UK. They are the Facebooks and the, whatever. So that's one big trend. And the other one is to negotiate that brave new world of the digital realms outside of the UK. Because it was easier when you were inside the EU, in terms of because you just had more heft, more weight, right? Now the world is divvied up, for better or worse, into 3 regulatory realms, especially in the digital sphere, and that's why people refer to them often as the digital realms, that the United States, the EU, and China, and they each advance and push forward with their regulation, especially on digitization, and for instance, the regulation of cross-border data flows. And now the UK needs to find its place in there. And that's particularly pertinent because everything the UK does in terms of services trade policies reflects on its relation, the UK's relation with each of these big partners, right? Maybe we're going to come on into the questions of the CPTPP. So that's one of these big Asia-Pacific plurilaterals, and the UK has just, I think, as of 31st of March, now an agreement in principle that the UK wants to accede to this, which is fine, but it raises a number of questions. If they fall in line with CITP in terms of cross-border data flows, it may perhaps jeopardize the equivalence decision with the EU. What CPTPP does in terms of agriculture may perhaps not go down so well here with the farmers, but also with a precautionary principle that is very much in favor in the EU. And that goes back to the hormones dispute for a long time. You're scratching the table, so I'll stop here.
No. What I think you're demonstrating, what all of you are demonstrating, is trade-offs get steeper, seemingly. They seem to be a feature of the debate now. But thank you very much, Inga. That was brilliant. And I was not expecting the one about policy, I have to say, the first. So that was excellent. So thank you very much, panelists.